Great. So hi everybody, and thank you to ME International for this opportunity. When I was contacted and asked to give a talk on wearable trackers, I thought, you know what, that is a fabulous topic. It's one that I hadn't really developed yet, so I really welcome the opportunity. Whenever someone asks me to talk on a new topic, it's a great opportunity for me to put my thoughts together and learn some new information, which I did for this talk. So there's definitely some new information here. Um, so this talk is all about pacing. I should say who I am first. So I'm Dr. Eleanor Stein. I am a recently retired physician and psychiatrist. I worked for the past 20 years of my practice, almost 25, exclusively with people with ME, CFS, fibromyalgia, environmental sensitivities. And right towards the end of my practice, I was starting to see some patients with long COVID. And since retiring at the end of 2022, I have devoted my time to trying to share all of the information that I've learned over the past 35 years with people around the world who are interested to learn it. We have so few resources in this field, and people are desperate. I get emails every day from people who are desperate for accurate information, who can't find a physician in their area or sometimes even in their country. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. And my lifestyle since retiring involves a lot of travel in my camper van. And so that's why maybe the photo image of me, the video image of me isn't crystal perfect because I'm in a beautiful wildlife location and the lighting isn't always perfect. So I apologize for that. And I should also mention, for those who don't know me, I also have 36 years of lived experience with ME, FM, chemical sensitivities, and I'll just say other assorted comorbidities. So everything I'm saying today comes from my own personal experience over the years. And I struggled for years with pacing until I got good information about how to do it, some of which I'm going to share with you today. I just I just kept crashing and crashing and crashing, and I didn't know what I was doing wrong. So from that experience and from the experience of working with thousands of patients over a couple decades, I've really learned that pacing is essential, right? Number one, most useful strategy to try to stabilize and then slowly improve energy to have a decent quality of life in which you can predictably make commitments to do things day to day without being blindsided by post-exertional malaise. So my goal today is to review some of the strategies I've learned over the years, and then to answer your questions to help you better understand how to use them. Because in this field, as I'm sure many of you know, we are all unique individuals. And so there's no recipe, there's no one strategy I could give you to say, do steps 1, 2, and 3, and then you'll be fine. It's to try some things, observe the outcome for your own body, and then maybe tweak it a little bit and try it again. So there's a lot of trial and error involved. So the pacing strategies are simple. The implementation, maybe not quite so simple. I'm going to start with a very brief outline of post-exertional malaise. I'm sure everybody watching this is already pretty familiar. So the term post-exertional malaise, we usually call it PEM, describes the exacerbation of multiple symptoms after very minor exertion. So some of the key points are that exertion could be physical, mental, or emotional. It's usually far less than what you were able to do before you became ill. So exertion, I kind of put it in air quotes because really for the average person, it wouldn't even be noted. And the thing about PEM that makes it so disabling is that it lasts for more than 24 hours. So that means if you exceed your energy envelope today, tomorrow you're going to be severely affected. Sometimes both the onset and the duration are delayed. So sometimes, and I've made this mistake myself more times than I can count. I'll go do an activity. I feel fine. I think, yes, I'm cured. Life is good. I rush out and do the same activity a day or two later, and maybe a day or two later after that. And the cumulative effect by the end of the week, I'm crashed. Not anymore. I'm talking now in the past. So this is what makes it so tricky. There's no absolute reliable timing or duration of PEM, and therefore being alert to the early warning signs is extremely helpful. What kind of symptoms worsen when people have PEM? It's very individual, but some of the most common are the flu-like symptoms, sore throat, feeling tired, and cold. I used to get freezing cold when I would have a PEM episode, pain, weakness, brain fog, and just overall inability to function. These are some of the most common symptoms of PEM. Right, I've talked about that, unpredictability. So it's important to note that although the activity limitations imposed by PEM, so of course, when people have post-exertional malaise, they start doing less because they can't, right? They're suffering from all of these symptoms, including usually severe fatigue. And this can lead to becoming less fit than you were before. But it's very important to know that the research is crystal clear that post-exertional malaise is not due to deconditioning. So just kind of put that out there up front to get rid of that myth existed in our field for over 20 years and has now been debunked. And even though the strategies I'm going to share with you are quite simple, hence the title of the handout that goes with this talk, even the most careful pacing can be insufficient to predictably complete planned activities unscathed by PEM. So even if you follow all of this, there's no guarantee you're going to have a smooth ride, but hopefully it's going to make things better. So a quick word about what fatigue and PEM are in people with what we now kind of use the umbrella term commonly of complex chronic disease. And that includes things like ME, CFS, long COVID, fibromyalgia, dysautonomia, MCAS, maybe post-treatment Lyme disease, big category of hard to treat conditions in that group. So what many of them have in common is that we don't have enough cellular energy. If you think of your phone battery, some people have had the experience where their battery quickly runs down faster than it should. So it's often running on low, and then it's harder to replenish or recharge it. That's kind of what our cells are like when we have one of these disorders. We just don't have as much energy. And if we use the little bit that we have, it takes longer to recharge. So that's kind of the plain language version. This next quick section, for those who are interested, I'm going to go a little bit into the science. So what actually causes that fatigue and PEM? So one of the leading theories is called the cell danger response. It was developed by a very brilliant researcher, Robert Navio, at University of California at San Diego. He and others after him, so this is now being replicated by several groups, have found exactly what I just described, that the mitochondria, the little organelles in our cells that make energy, are just not making as much. They've shifted from oxidative phosphorylation, which is how you can make energy really quickly and efficiently, to glycolysis, which still enables you to stay alive and make some energy, but at a far lower rate. Now, this cell danger response is in all animals. It's an evolutionarily preserved mechanism, which means it's really important. If all animals work the same way, it must serve a very important purpose. And the purpose is to protect us. So when our cells or mitochondria notice that there's too much oxidative stress and it's not going away, that's when they shift down or downregulate into this lower energy state. It saves us, but it doesn't allow us to have as much energy as we would like. In addition to this cellular response, research shows that we have autonomic dysfunction. So the autonomic nervous system controls heart rate and blood pressure, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about later in this talk. And in ME and long COVID, the amount of blood returning from the body to the heart is not as great as it should be. So when not enough blood comes back to the heart has to beat faster to try to push that little bit of blood back out to the rest of the body. Now, it may be that in some people, not as much blood is returning because it's all pooling in the legs. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. But we also have a strong suspicion that somehow over time, people with ME and probably long COVID as well, they actually begin to have less blood. So all the blood they have is circulating, but there's just not enough for the heart to beat slowly and efficiently and get it back up to the brain. There's also a really interesting finding from the Harvard group of researchers led by David Systrom of something called a left to right shunt. So normally what happens is the blood comes back to the heart pumps it to the lungs where it gets filled with oxygen and becomes bright red. That blood comes back to the heart and then gets pumped out around the body. As it goes to in the little tiny arterioles in tissues, the oxygen leaves the blood and moves into the tissues so that the cells in the tissues have the oxygen they need to make energy. And it looks like this isn't happening because this blood that's coming back to the heart has more oxygen than it should have. That means the oxygen isn't being made available to the body. This is a big problem. Obviously, we want as much oxygen as possible to get transferred into all of the body tissues. Now, one reason that this might happen, many people with ME probably understand the experience of air hunger. Air hunger is when you just never feel like you're quite getting enough air. And people with air hunger tend to then take deep breaths in an attempt to get more air. And unfortunately, that has a side effect. So when we exhale after that deep breath, we blow off a lot of carbon dioxide. And if we blow off even a tiny bit more than usual, it changes, what would be the right word? Like it changes the dynamics of our hemoglobin so that it doesn't let go of the oxygen the way it should when it gets to the tissues. So this may be connected with this lack of oxygenation. The last factor that may be contributing to fatigue is that we're now pretty confident that probably all of these complex chronic diseases involve inflammation of the body, and in many cases, inflammation of the brain. The immune system is an energy hog. So inflammation is basically a word to denote that the immune system is more active than it should be. And anything that's more active, that automatically means it's using energy. So this is my kind of quick and dirty science summary of what may be contributing behind the scenes to the fatigue and post-exertional malaise that people in our community suffer. I'm just going to pause there for a minute before I move into the pacing strategies and just see if there's any questions. Go ahead.
You were talking about the oxygen consumption, the air hunger. I
Yeah,
was wondering, is it related at all to like what happens when you have sleep apnea, or is it something
I
different?
don't think so.
Uh,
So that's a great question. In sleep apnea, the when we're lying back and when we're asleep, our muscle tone goes down, so things get more floppy. And the soft palate, if you kind of reach up at the top of your mouth, you have the hard palate in the front, and behind that is kind of a softer, floppier bit. What happens is that kind of relaxes, and in people with certain shaped anatomy in the throat, it just kind of blocks the airway. And
mhm.
so you're sleeping, and all of a sudden, no air can get through. And that is definitely air hunger. Most people with sleep
Right.
apnea kind of wake up gasping. So it looks the same on the outside, but I would say it's got a different cause.
Okay. The reason I have sleep apnea, Dr. Stein, and so
Hmm.
sometimes when I am experiencing the air hunger, I will lay down and I'll put the CPAP machine on, say in the middle of the day, and it seems to help me. That's why I asked the question.
That's
Maybe I am getting
interesting.
a little bit
Yeah,
more air, but
yeah,
it's something for further exploration.
yeah,
I
for
don't know how
sure.
many of the patients members overlap with that. I have the sleep apnea.
Well, I mean, we're going a tiny bit off topic, but sleep apnea is pretty common in society in general.
Hmm.
And in our community, the Centers for Disease Control, those very, very detailed studies that they've done over the years. If my memory serves me correct, they found that about 20% of people with, what they refer to as mecfs, have sleep apnea.
Okay.
So it's pretty common.
Okay.
Any other questions before I dive into the strategies? No? Okay, here I go. So pacing is the best management strategy. When you don't have enough energy, the solution is to use less, avoid using your battery for too long because remember, it's going to run down quicker than it used to or than other people's batteries. And plug in your battery more often. And that would be a metaphor for resting. And as I said, although these strategies are simple, they're easy to understand, implementing them often takes people months to years to fine tune and find the best pacing strategies at the right time for themselves. So, a take home message before I get into pacing, it's kind of the definition. So, pacing refers to the purposeful management of daily activities to minimize post exertional malaise. So, it means changing what you're doing. It does not mean pushing through and increasing what it doesn't mean doing whatever you want despite your low energy, right? It means adapting and accommodating. Now, in practice, this means, sorry, we just have a wasp in the van. There we go. In practice, this means really being aware of your energy levels and your own personal early warning signs that a crash is coming and stopping before the crash. So, take home message, it's much easier to avoid post exertional malaise than to recover from it. So, the first tip is if you notice your own personal early warning signs coming on, and it's possible to do so, take a break. Now, to help you understand the experience of PEM and kind of what pacing might look like, I want you to consider the metaphor of energy is like money. So we have energy coming in every night as we rest. We rebuild some of our energy stores. And then every day we spend energy on all of our activities. It's kind of like money, right? Hopefully, every month we have some money coming in, and then we have numerous expenditures, and we have to try to budget that money so that it covers all the expenditures. It's exactly the same with energy. The problem is that people with complex chronic diseases are on a low energy budget. Many of us are on low financial budget as well, but low energy budget. And many times the things we want to do in the day, our projected expenditures, are bigger than the energy dollars we have available. So in these cases, we're constantly being faced with decisions. Should we stay within our budget and miss out on something we want or need to do? Or should we do the activity anyway, knowing we don't have quite enough money, energy dollars in the bank to pay for it? Now, if you take the money metaphor a little bit further, most of us use a line of credit or a credit card for those times when we don't have the money in the bank at that moment, but we really want or need to pay for something. So we can do that with energy as well. If you occasionally overspend by using your energy credit card, and I'm going to mention what that is in a moment, it's okay as long as you pay off your bill at the end of every few days. So with a money credit card, you only have to pay it off once a month. With an energy credit card, you wouldn't want to go longer than a few days without paying it off, because if you don't pay it off, we all know what happens, interest accumulates. And you never want to get into the position where you're spending valuable energy dollars on interest instead of on activities. So that means you never really want to build up too much of a debt. In addition to the sheer energy dynamics, it's psychologically stressful to have a high debt, right? It's always weighing on your mind that you're in a position where you have so little in reserve that if the slightest unexpected thing happens, you're going to be stuck. So you always want to have a small rainy day fund, meaning a little bit of energy left in your bank in case something unexpected comes up. My suggestion is to pay off your energy debt if you incur one every few days and basically commit to living debt free. So that would be the equivalent of not having a credit card. Why do I say that? For money, we have a credit card like a Visa. For energy, our credit card is something called adrenaline. So if you have very little energy in your bank today and something arises and you decide, you know what, I have to or really, really want to do this activity, despite the fact that my bank is near empty, you can do it. And the way you do it is by firing up adrenaline. So adrenaline is like coffee. It gives you an artificial sense of energy. It will get you through the activity in most cases. You might be really crashed afterwards. And an additional problem with adrenaline, as many of you know, is when it comes time to sleep that evening, the adrenaline is still in your body because it takes several hours for adrenaline to be broken down by the liver and excreted by the kidneys and to get out of your system. It's not an on-off switch. So if you use adrenaline regularly, it's really going to disrupt your sleep. Now, the promise of pacing, and this is based on Leonard Jason's study, which is now, 15 or 16 years old. So it's an older study, but nothing has come out subsequently showing it's not true. Everything really over time is supporting that pacing is the best strategy. So the promise is that if you pace well enough notice I'm not saying perfectly because none of us are perfect. So you pace well enough over time, and that time frame is usually 3 to 6 months. So this is very slow. Your baseline energy each day will start to increase. If you continually spend all of your energy dollars and you're running on empty and you're crashing and firing up adrenaline on a regular basis, you may actually get worse over time instead of better. So to me, this is a critical difference. How do you know if you've overspent? The telltale signs of increased adrenaline are that your heart rate is faster. So you can usually feel your heart beating faster and stronger in your chest. And often, especially if you're prone to anxiety, you're going to feel hyper because adrenaline not only changes our kind of physical biology of the heart, but whenever our heart beats faster, the mind goes, oh, there must be an emergency, and it kind of ramps up its anxiety and vigilance levels. So I'll maybe just again pause to see if there's any questions before I talk about how to use wearable trackers, because I've kind of set the stage now by explaining why wearable trackers are so valuable, because adrenaline is a sign that we might have overdone it, and that's very accurately measured by the trackers. Any comments or questions?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why cortisol seems to be off on a lot of people? Like mine's too low when it needs to be high and too high when it needs to be low and that sort of thing. Is
Yeah.
that connected with the adrenaline problem?
So I don't think any of us know. It's very clear in ME research over literally 40 years that that's the case, right? In general, people with ME/CFS have slightly lower morning cortisol than we should. And although it hasn't been reported in the research, it was definitely my clinical experience because I would order what's called 4-point cortisols on people, where they would take their cortisol, 6 or 7 a.m., around noon, around supper time, around 11 p.m. And what you're looking for is that normal cortisol diurnal curve, which is that the cortisol increases in the early morning hours to help get you revved and ready to wake up. You have to kind of preparing the body. So you want your highest cortisol of the day to be 6 a.m.-ish. And then it should slowly decrease because now you're up. It's done its job. And it would be the lowest around 11 p.m. so that you can easily fall asleep. So that would be the ideal cortisol curve. Many people that I saw, and I don't think it's only in our community, I think it's people with chronic disease in general, they have a low cortisol in the morning, which means it's really hard to get up because you don't have that. It's like your inner coffee. And then you're pushing and pushing and pushing to get through the day. And you accomplish that by adrenaline and cortisol rising. And now it's 6 o'clock and your cortisol's high when it should be low. And now it's 11 o'clock and you can't fall asleep because you've got too much cortisol on board. So I don't know. That's what I really see. It's a very common pattern. I don't know if that's what you're noticing.
And that's why you get that, what they call wired but tired sensation.
Exactly.
Can't
Yeah.
sleep.
That's exactly right. Cortisol and adrenaline, I think they both contribute. And I don't think we know why exactly that happens, other than probably it's a sign of chronic stress. So I say that with caution because people go, "Oh my God, you're a psychiatrist. You're telling us we're all stressed." So I don't mean emotional stress necessarily, although that could be part of it, but just the stress on the body of trying to get through a day with insufficient energy. That's incredibly stressful. And I think that's my kind of non-scientific idea of why this happens, is that we're pushing and pushing and pushing, trying to get through the day, and cortisol is a tool. And so the body helps us by increasing cortisol to help us get through the day. But it's a vicious circle because then we can't sleep, and then it's harder to get up the next morning and so on.
Yeah, but sleep deprivation or irregular sleep is one of my worst contributors to my problems. So
Yes, I think, right. Okay. Any other comments or questions before I dive into the wearable trackers? Yep, Janet.
Yes, Dr. Stein. I was wondering because I know when I was first diagnosed, I have, and still do have a great neurologist, and he did order the cortisol tests. And is there like a standard code? Because at that time it was out of pocket expense, but
Mm.
I don't know if that's something that's
Well,
kind of universal because some people might benefit from having that test.
so I don't know, I'm Canadian, right?
Yes.
So in Canada, and it sounds like it from what you're saying, it might be the same in the US. If you just go to the lab and have a cortisol done, it's usually covered. But the
Okay.
one that isn't covered is the 4-point saliva. So in Canada,
Right.
it's the same way. If you get that one, which is, there's a lot of controversy over that test. So I'm not going to say it's the be all and end all. But what's helpful about it is you get to do it at home because it's very stressful to get your butt out to the lab at, say, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and it's not even open at 11 p.m. So I always think if I see high cortisols, it's just because I made the person leave their house 3 times in the day. So even with some criticism of the cortisol test, which, I'm not a endocrinologist, so I'm not totally sure how valid the criticism is, but it's what I call ecologically valid, meaning you're at home doing your regular activities and it doesn't stress you out to do the test. So I think when I see that reverse pattern, the low to high instead of the high to low, I mean, I put some weight in that. I used to think, yep, that's telling me something. And some of those people I would use or recommend what we call physiologic doses of hydrocortisone replacement. So low dose hydrocortisone, 5 or 10 milligrams in the morning, just to help people get over that hump so that like some people would say with that, say 10 milligrams in the morning, they could exhale. They didn't feel this sense of having to work so hard to get through the day. And then they didn't push their cortisol up so high in the evening. But of course, if you do any intervention like that, then you have to retest, which is an additional cost to know if it's working or not, right? Because if it's not working, there's no point in taking the medication.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I'm going to go back to the handout. Okay, so this is the part you've been waiting for. So my understanding is that MEI has acquired some Fitbit Versa 3 wearable trackers. The instruction, I personally don't, I have a different tracker myself. So the instructions I've been told are that you install the Fitbit app on your phone and then you start using it. And my suggestion is to use it for a week or 2 weeks to accumulate enough data that you know what your baselines are. So the whole point of using a tracker is not to compare yourself to others, but it's to compare yourself to yourself. So the first step is to figure out what are your baseline measurements. And I'm going to describe what measurements you're looking for so that on a given day, you can judge if you're doing kind of better, the same, or worse than your typical day and make decisions accordingly. Now, apparently on the free membership to the Fitbit Versa 3, they only keep the data for you for a month and you have to pay money for the kind of premium membership if you want to keep track of your data over longer periods of time. So that's what I've been told. Hopefully it's accurate information. So the two specific metrics that I'm going to talk about because they're very accurately measured by the Fitbit and virtually all what I call second generation trackers are heart rate and heart rate variability. So that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So heart rate is the measure of how fast the heart is beating at any given point in time. If you have what I call real-time tracking, meaning the number of your heart rate is showing at all times, which I believe it does on the Fitbit, then you can see at any given time, oh, my heart rate's 60, oh, my heart rate's 80, my heart rate's 52, whatever. So in general, what is a normal heart rate? In general, lower is better. Of course, within like too low is bad, 0 would mean you're dead. So we don't want it that low. But in general, most people with ME/CFS, many years ago, I did a review of like 30 different studies of ME/CFS in which they measured heart rate. And I think in like 28 of them, heart rate is elevated. So I think because of the physical stress that our body is under, the lack of energy, how hard it is to get through the day, all of these things, the fact that we're not giving off as much oxygen to the tissues as we should be, not enough blood is coming back to the heart, like all of these physiological factors taken together somehow results in our hearts beating faster than average or than would be ideal. So an ideal resting heart rate, first thing in the morning, before we get out of bed, should be between about 50 and 60. Now, many of the trackers also give you a number of what was your average heart rate overnight while you were asleep. That's a valuable number, and that number is often even lower because in the ideal world, our sympathetic autonomic tone, that's our fight, flight, adrenaline state, our revved up state, should be at its lowest at night while we sleep. And our parasympathetic tone, that's our rest and digest, vagus nerve, calming aspect of the autonomic nervous system, that should be at its highest while we sleep. I was really shocked when I got my tracker because I have autonomic dysfunction and orthostatic intolerance, and my my daytime heart rate generally runs a little bit high, just like many of you. But when I looked at my nighttime average, it's typically in the 40s, which I guess is quite normal. At first I thought it was too low, but actually that's how relaxed we should be at night so that our heart rate may even dip below 50. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a ballpark. So we want our heart rate to be constantly changing. We could not function if our heart rate is always the same. Now, many of my patients, when they first got their wearable trackers, they got anxious because they could see how different their heart rate was from one moment to the next. And when they did activity, they could see that their heart rate went quite a bit higher, at least temporarily. And that made them worried. So I just want to say that's the job of the heart, is to respond to the demands that you're putting upon it. If you see your heart rate varying a lot, be happy. It means your heart is healthy and it's able to respond to the demands that it's noticing. Keep in mind also that the heart rate needs to beat faster, not only when we're doing physical activity, but also mental and emotional activity. The brain uses 20% of the body's energy, 20%. So if you're worried or if you're concentrating on a hard mental task, your heart rate's going to go up. And sorry. So we want our heart rate to increase when we're active. That's a sign of health. And then a sign of fitness is that within about an hour of stopping the activity, we want our heart rate to return to its baseline. So in athletes or in heart patients, this is a measure that they look for. How long does it? I'm just hearing some background noise, so I'm just wondering if everyone's mics are turned off. Maybe someone could double check that, just for the fidelity of the recording. So that's a thing to check for yourself. If you've overdone an activity, chances are it's going to take more than an hour for your heart rate to return to its baseline. So now I'm going to talk about heart rate variability. This one is a little bit more complicated. So heart rate variability refers to the variation in what's called the period. That's the time between each heartbeat and the next heartbeat. Heart rate variability is an incredibly accurate, non-invasive measure of our autonomic nervous system. So this is so great because before we had these wearable trackers, people would have very uncomfortable tests, the details of which I will spare you, to try to stick probes inside various parts of the body to figure out how the autonomic nervous system was working. Now, there's different measures of heart rate variability, RMSSD, complicated term, but that's basically the good overall measure. And that's the measure that is translated into a number in most wearable trackers. And it's a combination, that number, of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic tone. Now, in general, the heart rate and the heart rate variability should be a mirror image. So as your heart rate goes up, your heart rate variability goes down. I'll explain why. Heart rate variability is highest when there's variability between very low and very high heart rates beat to beat. But if we're exercising, we cut off the bottom part of that curve. We don't have a low heart rate anymore because it has to be high all the time because we're exercising, as an example. So therefore, even though we're healthy, there's nothing wrong with this, our heart rate is functioning as it should, our heart rate variability temporarily is lower. A heart that doesn't respond to circumstances, so people with heart disease, for example, will have less variability. And this means when we need emergency blood supplies to a certain organ, we may not get it. In cardiology, heart rate variability has been used for over 40 years, and it's actually a quite accurate predictor after a heart attack or for people in ICU of survival. So after a heart attack, if your heart rate variability is high, you're going to have a good prognosis, all other things being equal. Now, it's worth noting that there's many studies in ME and CFS and fibromyalgia looking at heart rate and heart rate variability. I already mentioned that heart rate is generally higher than it should be, and heart rate variability is generally lower than it should be, with the number one problem being too low of a parasympathetic tone. So in heart rate variability lingo, this is called the high frequency component of the curve. So if you ever see HF, it won't show up on your tracker, but if you're reading papers, that's indicating the parasympathetic tone, and it's generally lower than it should be. Now, a recent study from 2020 showed that there is, not only are they abnormal, because it's kind of easy to show that in research, what's harder to show is there a correlation between whatever it is you're measuring strong correlations between heart rate and heart rate variability and symptom severity. So here is my kind of 4-point plan to how to use your wearable trackers. So my suggestion is, number one, look at your tracker first thing in the morning and write down what your heart rate is. Have a chart next to your bed, because you want to find out your baseline. So you want to record for, say, 10 days. 10 days is usually a big enough number of days to get an accurate average. So you want to look at what is your average morning heart rate before you start thinking, before you check your phone, and before you get out of bed. Again, a lower number is generally better. It means that you had a better quality rest at night and your heart rate has come down, meaning your heart can relax and pump blood slowly and efficiently. Whenever we're tense or we haven't yet recovered from what we did the previous day, adrenaline will remain in the body because adrenaline automatically is produced when we need it to function, and your heart rate will remain a little bit higher. So take a look at your heart rate before you rise. If that heart rate is lower than your baseline, so first you have to establish your baseline. Say, for the sake of example, your morning resting heart rate lying in bed before you get up is 65. If you get up today and your heart rate is 60, that means for you, you've fully recovered from the day before, and chances are you've got a little bit more energy dollars in your bank account than usual, and you might be able to plan a few more activities. So this morning heart rate is extremely useful because it kind of helps you plan your day. If, on the other hand, you woke up and your resting heart rate was 72, so 7 beats higher than your baseline, that is pretty strong evidence that you're not fully recovered. And if you're someone who suffers from post-exertional malaise, this would be a strong hint or recommendation that you should take it easy today and pace carefully. Next, I would look at your heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is never measured in real time like heart rate. You won't be able to see on your watch, oh, my heart rate variability is 38. That will never happen because the moment-to-moment heart rate variability is not very meaningful. What is meaningful is the average overnight heart rate variability. So usually on most trackers, you get a number in the morning saying HRV equals some number, or it could show you, it's usually an average overnight. And you want that number to be as high as possible. So if you wake up and your overnight average heart rate variability is lower than usual, that's bad. That means you're probably not fully recovered. Your heart is still beating faster than it should to catch up from everything you did the day before. If, on the other hand, you wake up and your heart rate variability is higher than your baseline, that's a good sign that you may have fully recovered and may be able to do a bit more that day. So that's steps 1 and steps 2 are using the scores on your wearable tracker first thing in the morning to help you plan your day. So part 3 is, okay, now you're in your day, you're doing stuff. Is there any way you can use your tracker to figure out how you're doing? Are you overdoing it? Are you staying within your energy envelope? The best tool for that is to look at what I call real-time heart rate. So that's the heart rate number that's usually pulsing with a little heart next to it on your watch. A rough estimate of your energy envelope. Okay, very, very rough. I made this up, from 40 years experience, but nevertheless, it's a simple tool to help you use these numbers effectively and easily. So we all talk about energy envelope. That's the amount of energy in the bank you have to spend that day. But how do you really know how much money you have in your bank? So if your resting heart rate in this moment is, say, 65 beats per minute, say that's your personal baseline, and you're resting, you're sitting down, having your morning coffee. And through personal experience, so this is another one where you have to pay attention and track and write some numbers down and average them out to figure out your baseline. So say you've noticed through experience that whenever you consistently hit a heart rate of 120 for a period of time, you start feeling unwell and you're headed for a crash. So 120 is the magic number at which many people move from aerobic metabolism. That's, remember I talked about it before, that's when you can efficiently make a lot of energy, to anaerobic metabolism. That's when you're shut down and you're using glycolysis and you're not going to make as much energy. So that's called the anaerobic or lactate threshold. And for many average people, that number is about 120. So for many people, if they push their heart rate, the vigorousness of their activity to such an extent that their heart rate goes above 120 for a period of time, there is a strong likelihood that a crash may be coming. Now, this depends a lot on disease severity. So that might be for a mildly affected person. If you're moderately affected, that number might be lower. It might be 110 beats per minute. If you're severely affected, it might be 90 or 100 beats per minute, meaning you can't push your heart rate as high without running out of room and crashing. So the energy envelope is the difference between your baseline heart rate at rest, say in this example, 65 beats per minute, and say you're a mildly affected person with ME and your anaerobic threshold, or the heart rate at which you begin to feel unwell, is about 120. That means your energy envelope or your reserve capacity is 120 minus 65, which is 55 beats per minute. That's pretty good. You can do a lot of stuff in that space. But say now you're a severely affected person and your resting heart rate is 100, right? This is very, very common in the community. People are so stressed just through the act of living that their heart rate never comes down to the 60s. And say because you're severely ill, your anaerobic threshold or the heart rate at which you begin to feel unwell is also 100. This is also extremely common. That means you have no energy envelope at all. And that means your entire day is spent carefully pacing activities. So this is a way you can use your real-time heart rate on your tracker to see whether you have any room to increase activity between the heart rate that you are in that moment and this number, which you can discern by careful observation time. What is the heart rate at which, if you were to stay up there for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, you would start to feel unwell? Now, just a reminder that both heart rate and heart rate variability change constantly, so don't be worried by a few scores. Really look at the long-term trends. Okay. I'm going to say one more thing. I've still got a couple topics to go. So what is a normal or healthy heart rate variability? So heart rate, people understand and they can see it on their watch, and it's easy for them to know, are they in kind of the healthy range for them or not? Heart rate variability is a little bit more nuanced. So on the handout, which I sent to you a while ago, I was so excited when I came across this 2018 study with basically analyzing Fitbit data for 8 million users from 74 countries. So in medical circles, that's a massive study. They showed a few things. One, heart rate variability gradually decreases with age. So remember I said a higher number is better. Unfortunately, like everything else, as we age, Just the way our body works, that number decreases. Number two, in younger years, men have slightly higher or more beneficial heart rate variability than females, but over time, women catch up and even surpass men as we get older. So it's a bit of a shift there. The other really clear finding was that heart rate variability first thing in the morning is always better than heart rate variability later in the day. And again, it's just because of the physiology, because in the morning we're rested and our heart rate has the maximal opportunity to be high or low. And that means variability is at its peak. And in all ages, walked per day, which of course is another feature of Fitbit wearable trackers, and a stronger, healthier heart rate variability. And this correlation was stronger in younger people, probably because they exercise more. So I know this is extremely upsetting for people in the community who desperately wish they could exercise as a way of improving their heart rate variability, but there are other ways. So remember, I mentioned that heart rate variability score is a combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic components. And we have some pretty time tested strategies to increase vagal tone or parasympathetic tone in addition to exercise. So exercise is one of the best, but if you can't exercise, all is not lost. So other strategies include meditation and paced breathing. And I would say paced breathing is probably the more powerful of those. Every time you slow your breath, especially on the out breath, you kick in and activate the vagus nerve. So even if you can't exercise, paced breathing practice daily, you may see an improvement in your heart rate variability scores. Now, when I first did prepared my talk, that was the whole talk, but I was asked to add one additional section. So I'm going to do that right now. And that is the very good question of what if stress is affecting your heart rate and your heart rate variability? Because remember, I said this isn't only measuring physical manifestations and activities, it also picks up on emotion. So if we're very stressed, our heart rate variability will plummet. I can give you a personal example many years ago. So I've had the capacity to measure heart rate variability for 25 years. I did it routinely in my office. Every patient got measured. And of course, I had it at home, so I could play with it when I worked at home. So I had all my toys at home and I could play with them whenever I wanted. So this one time I had to do a legal case, right? Very big legal case, which I dislike because I feel such a strong responsibility to do a good job and not mess up and not get tricked by the lawyer on the other side, et cetera, et cetera. So I came home from the hearing and I was feeling extremely stressed. And I thought, because I didn't know if I had done a good job or not. And I thought, I'm going to measure my heart rate variability. So I have a, high-end system that I can measure it in real time. I don't have to rely on overnight the next day. That was before I ever had a wearable tracker. So I can measure it in real time. So I laid down and I put it on and my heart rate variability was like 0, right? It was non-existent. And that was really impactful to me because I went, right, heart rate variability is doing its job. It is in the toilet because of my emotional stress right now. So what I've observed with my, thousands of patients over decades is that people who are have a more tendency to experience stress and or anxiety have a really bigger challenge in terms of recovering or increasing their health. And I think it's for some of the reasons we've already talked about that when I'm stressed, even if I'm sitting down physically resting, I'm using a lot of energy. And adrenaline and cortisol are part of the stress response system. So I'm firing them up all the time or frequently. So I've noticed that these people are more exhausted, right? People that carry a lot of stress have more fatigue. And I think it's because the stress is literally using up energy. Thought about, okay, what are the core ways of managing stress to try to stop this or mitigate this problem? My first tip is that changing perception is far more effective than trying to avoid stress. So I've worked with many patients over the years whose response, so stress is inevitable. Let's start there, right? We all have stressors in our life. It's just like being alive, things are constantly changing. Change is stressful. Not knowing what's going to happen next is stressful. And we in the complex chronic disease community have more stress than average because we're more dependent. We're dependent on our family members, our friends, our disability support providers, our healthcare team for much needed assistance. And being in a dependent position is more stressful. So if we view stress, I did a webinar a few months ago with Simon Pimenta. It's freely available on my website, and it's called How to Make Stress Your Ally. And in it, I dive into this a little bit more deeply. But basically, I did a ton of reading on the mindset around stress. So if you view stress as something harmful and to be avoided and kind of a necessary evil of life, but something that you really dislike and try to avoid whenever possible, then when stress inevitably happens, as it does pretty much every day to most of us, it shoots your cortisol up because you see it as a negative. You have that mindset. If you undergo the exact same stress, but you see it as an opportunity for growth, your cortisol goes into the perfect Goldilocks zone. So what I took from that research, and that was just a few months ago that I kind of delved into that, is that if we view stress as dangerous, it will be dangerous. It will shoot up our cortisol and adrenaline, and it will make pacing and getting into that rest, digest, and calm parasympathetic state much more difficult. So here's some questions you could ask yourself to challenge your perception or to imagine a different perception. What if you had a natural confidence that things would work out even though you don't know how? Do you think that would change your stress level? What if you practiced radical acceptance? That means accepting even the things you don't like, acknowledging that you don't actually know in any moment what the future may bring and whether those things will be good for you or not. What if you had the confidence in yourself that even if adversity happened, you could handle it? And what if you used your imagination to practice being calm and joyful? So many of you know I do a lot of work in the field of neuroplasticity. I have a whole course on it, teaching people how to use it. And one of the core neuroplasticity strategies is to use the imagination to start wiring together the new neural connections that you want and need to actually change your life. And using I'm going to give you a personal example from last night. So I'm living in my van, and my van has a very noisy fridge that turns on and off all night. So 2 nights ago, I was beside myself. I'm not going to be able to sleep. So last summer, I had a really crappy summer of sleep. And this year I decided, okay, I've got to use mind over matter here because the fridge is there and I need the fridge and I got to somehow get sleep at the same time. So last night I did about 20 minutes of imaginary practice in which I imagined the fridge, which I could hear because it's right next to me, was lulling me to sleep, that it was a beautiful, calming kind of white noise vibration that was going to benefit me. And I did that kind of over and over for about 20 minutes right before I went to bed. And I actually had the best sleep last night I've had in my van. Like I probably slept 7.5 hours almost straight through. It was incredible. And I feel great today. So this is just an example. You can imagine the future you want to have, even though you have no idea how you're going to achieve it. And it trains your brain to the new habit and the new default. And actually, the research shows that you form new neural connections for the things that you're imagining, even though you haven't done them. I'll just leave it there. Another strategy, so strategy 2 is if you have recurrent worries or negative thoughts, you may need to spend some time to process and resolve them, right? They're not necessarily going to just go away on their own, and imagining them away is not likely to be successful. So it may be the case that you need even some professional help to resolve trauma or to deal with anxiety. I just had a email this morning from, I get emails all the time from people that come to my website asking how to manage severe anxiety. And I said, you know what, you got to go to someone who's an expert in that. I don't have those resources on my website. But these anxiety and trauma get in the way of recovery. So it's really worth finding some kind of treatment or online training, or even a good friend or a religious mentor, like whatever is comfortable for you, to find a way to work through and get rid of the emotional charge that's associated with things that have happened in your life, because they are potentially draining your energy. Then the last two strategies are to calm the mind and to calm the body. So calming is useful, but unless you change your perception of stress, you're going to be spending your entire life calming, right? If every time something stressful happens, your fight or flight ramps up, now you've got some more calming practice to do. So calming on its own is probably not the solution, but it's a great immediate strategy when you feel or see on your tracker that your heart rate is going up. And when you do a calming practice, whether it's meditation, visualization, yoga nidra, restorative yoga, paced breathing, doesn't matter what the strategy is, you've got your wearable tracker and you can see for yourself in real time. The goal is you want to bring your heart rate down. If you can bring your heart rate down 5 to 10 beats per minute through paced breathing, you've got a very great skill there that you can use whenever you need it. In the handout, I've got 2 pacing resources. One is called the Pacing and Management Guide for mecfs and Long COVID, and it's at the Resource Center of the Open Medicine Foundation website. It was prepared by Action ME and the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, so very credible authors. There's also a great resource. It's older and many people may not know about it. It's called cfsselfhelp.org. It was founded, probably 30 years ago now, by Bruce Campbell, who is a psychologist, I guess retired psychologist, who I believe was personally affected with ME. And he created this very low cost website. He himself is now retired, but it's still continuing and offers courses for as little as $20. Many of my patients took their courses and found them very helpful. Very last thing, when I give a talk like this, I usually try to find some additional piece of information as a bonus. And for this talk, I've chosen chapter 1 of my new book. It's all about goal setting. So it kind of lays out in some degree of detail different ways that you can set goals to move ahead with your health. It doesn't tell you which goal, and to identify the goals that are important to you. And it can be found at a link. Maybe I will put the link in the chat. And it's also on the revised handout. So let me just come back to Zoom and chat. Okay, so I've just put the link in the chat. And maybe, Jim, when you post the recording, you could include this link with it, and then people can get this additional information. So it's basically on my website, we created a special page just for MEI members. So it's called MEI-May 2024. So that's all I've got. I'd love to open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That was very interesting for me. I just discovered a few days ago how to find those measures on my Fitbit that I've had for 3 years. And I also really appreciate the you're talking about ways that how important it is to change our perceptions and to relax our bodies and to decrease vagal tone, and ways to do that.
Increase.
Increase.
Yeah, we
Oh,
want
I'm
more
frozen.
vagal tone. And interestingly enough, another total digression, but I'm reading a new book right now on vagal tone by Dr. Nawaz Habib, who's a Canadian chiropractor, it's really well written, very detailed. And he's talking, the section I'm reading right now is how the vagus nerve basically calms inflammation. So it's not just when we activate the vagus nerve, we're not only just calming the heart rate, we actually may be calming inflammation, which, as many of you know, is increasingly recognized as kind of an underpinning of ME and related disorders. So this, using your wearable tracker to get your heart rate down, that's just like the outward manifestation, but a whole bunch of other benefits might be accruing inside the body that you can't see.
And an extremely important point, which I haven't known all this time, is that it doesn't mean I've been lying in bed for 7 years, and I keep saying all I do is rest, but I'm getting worse. I'm not getting better. That bed rest is not the answer.
Yeah, so I changed the wording of that. So initially on the handout, I put bed rest is not the answer. And one of your members, kindly wrote me quite a detailed response to that, saying, you know what, short periods of bed rest are extremely helpful. So for people that are moderate to severely affected, having a horizontal rest in the day with what I call eyes and ears closed. So not on your phone, not listening to podcasts, right? Literally horizontal, eyes and ears closed, maybe doing paced breathing or breath, mindful meditation, something like that. Extremely helpful as a pacing strategy. But what I was meaning, I've now added like extended bed rest is not helpful. There's people in the field who have recommended like 3 months of bed rest. I don't think that's helpful because there's this principle that we have to challenge our bodies little bits at a time intermittently to stay healthy, like for the body processes to really work in our favor. And I think bed rest is just preventing that from happening. Now, having said that, there are people who are the extremely ill, right? The 25% who are bedbound through no fault or choice of their own. So I'm not talking about them whatsoever, but they have to do what they have to do to survive. But for people who are able to get up, even having short periods of movement, gentle movement, Maybe it's just walking to the mailbox and back, or doing some very light stretches. Whatever is within your capability is better than total bed rest, in my opinion.
Yes, thank you so much. I value your experience.
Yeah, you're welcome. Looks like Chelsea has a question.
I don't know if this is one you'll have information about, but I have the Visible app, which
Yes, I've heard of it.
I'm able to just get a morning reading. I don't have they now, still like relatively new, but one Sylvan, I'm sorry, my son. I'm on the call still. Okay. You can measure your heart rate variability and your heart rate in the morning without the, they have sort of the equivalent of a Fitbit that's like a visible tracker, which I don't have yet. And I'm thinking I do want to get a tracker, and I'm don't know, the pros and cons of like the visible tracker versus the Fitbit, or whether it matters, or if they're all pretty much, the same at the end of the day.
I would, yeah. So of course, there's so many brands out there. I don't know all of them, right? There's something called the Whoop band, which is, I think, does a pretty good job and is quite inexpensive. So the thing I look for, because I'm cheap, is I hate something where I have to pay a monthly fee to get the benefits. And unfortunately, more and more of the trackers are going to that monthly fee model. So if I personally were looking for a tracker, here would be my wish list. I definitely want it to have real-time heart rate, because I want, if I'm moving, and say I know that I tend to crash at a heart rate of 110, it's super handy to be able to see that. And even better, even more handy, and this used to be on the old Polar monitors, but I'm not sure it's on many of the newer ones. The ideal is to have an alarm, so that you can set an alarm to beep if you go over or under a certain heart rate. That's extremely helpful, because then you don't have to pay attention. Like, the goal of this tracking is to actually live your life, not to spend all your time paying attention to the tracker, right? So if you're able to set an alarm, that's ideal, because you can just go about your day. You don't even have to glance at your watch, and you know that it'll beep if you're hitting your kind of the boundary where you have to start being careful. So I would love an alarm. I would love real-time heart rate tracking. And then I would love this overnight number of heart rate and heart rate variability, because that tells you how much you've recovered and helps you plan your day. I think those are the 4 essentials.
Great.
If you have disordered breathing, I'll just say, because I noticed that having these sleep problems, and I was curious about my oxygen. So that might be a good one if you're an older person, because obstructive sleep apnea, that was asked about before, gets more and more common with increasing age. So it's very uncommon in very young people, much more common in, say, 50 plus.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any last questions? Just go ahead. Yeah.
I don't want to, I'm sorry, I can't find where you raise your hand on the interface here. Everything's a little different. I haven't used the Zoom interface in a while. But one of the things, and this sort of crosses the, the bridge between, it's physiological versus what you can do mentally. Our body and our minds are interconnected. Our brain is part of the physiology. But one of the techniques I learned deals with, like, when I start feeling a symptom, which for me is maybe a headache coming on. That's one of my signals. I will do, like, I lay down and I'll do like move my eyes. I would like sort of it's kind of like a form of self hypnosis. So it's like eye movement and desensitization technique.
Mhm.
Have you seen that all in terms of benefit in general?
I haven't seen anything particularly like that, but in the traumatic brain injury field, I've heard two different speakers now talk about, I guess when we have a brain injury, it kind of throws off some of our normal eye movements and other sensory input. And one of the new strategies for helping people with TBI is apparently involves some eye exercises. I don't know, I guess it depends what kind of problem you have, what exercises to do, but it's interesting you've come across that by yourself. It makes some sense because you're trying to teach your brain. So I would guess I'm not a real headache sufferer, but people just tend to go to bed and like close their eyes, right? Put the cold cloth on. So by training your brain that this headache is not a sign of danger, by continuing to move your eyes, it's giving your brain a subliminal message that you're
Oh,
okay.
okay.
So I think from a neuroplasticity point of view, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and I have to say, I didn't discover it on my own, but when I was working with the neurologist who also was certified as a psychiatrist, that's the way he got me into a more hypnotic state. And
Got
I
it.
just carried it on because I felt like when I have the headache coming on, it helps. And so I just, because the other thing is, I know from just dealing with the community is that a lot of people, like my first discovery was on an MRI of my brain, right? That had some I forgot we ended up calling them freckles, white spots.
Yeah,
And
the
I
white
think others
spots.
have, something like that. So I sort of went into saying, okay, well, how can I make my brain, because it is brain inflammation. So how can I reduce my brain inflammation? And I think also with the I know I rate higher on a scale for perception. I don't know about the overall people who suffer from this, but it's important for me to reduce sensory overload. So when I was first
Right.
diagnosed back in 2006, I was calling it information overload because it was just too many incoming signals. And so I was thinking some of your methods for changing your perception also deals with trying to reduce the sensory overload. I know some people wear sunglasses but also just taking your rest break. I do take periodic rest breaks during the day, and that has helped immensely.
And
So,
that's a really good point. So many people with ME have sensory overload. We call it MCS or tinnitus, right? But basically our brains aren't filtering, which again is very similar to people with head injuries. And my increasing sense from what I'm reading and hearing is the more we can give our brain the message that it's safe and kind of almost do the opposite, like not to go out in the bright sun, but maybe you're out in moderate sun and you take your sunglasses off for 2 minutes, right? And you train your brain, it's okay. A little bit of light is good. Because if you constantly then wear your sunglasses, again, subliminally, you're telling your brain, yeah, you're right. This is really dangerous. We got to keep sunglasses on at all times. Like this is all below the level of consciousness, right? You're
right, yeah.
you're just trying to stop the headache or whatever. You're doing a really normal response, but the brain goes, oh, right, this is a big problem. We better really warn them a lot about how much light is coming in. And it becomes, you can build up increasing sensitivity over time.
Okay. Thank you. This has
Yeah, you're
been very
welcome.
informative
Thanks.
and practical, which is
Good.
so important. But I think you have a real talent for bridging sort of the research into what can I do on a daily basis. So very much appreciate it, Dr. Stein.
Thank you. I noticed a few people with their mics on, so any other comments or questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, you're talking about the pace breathing and meditation and stuff. And I know you have your own site. I was wondering for the people that'll watch this recording, if you could briefly tell them some of the resources that you have available that they can access.
Sure, can I share my screen for a sec? Because I could just,
Sure.
it's probably easier to show it than to try to describe it. So let me just first, so far I'm not able, but I'll just open my site and then do you know how to give me permission?
I think you can now.
Okay. So let me go back into shared screen. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be changing my website a little bit in hopefully the near future, but these bars at the top are kind of my new tabs. So I'll just walk you through incredibly quickly. So this is your best tab right here because everything is free. So this is newsletter sign up where you get information about events like this. My blogs, which are free, tons of videos. That's where I mentioned before, I have that video on making stress your ally. So that whole aspect around mindset of stress. I do have some free audios for relaxation. Video tips of the month. So every month I put out a tip, and this month is on low dose naltrexone. So different topic entirely. And then this is other resources. So these are all other websites that have useful resources. And what's this one? Oh, this is my publications. So, some of these may or may not be of interest. Some of them are kind of heavy duty, but those would be the main things. And then if you ever want to see what's coming up on my website, these are free and paid events. So I've just started an expert speaker series where once a month I have an expert in something. So the two upcoming talks for the end of May and the end of June are on Lyme disease as an example. So things that I'm not an expert on. And some of the events are free, like next Friday, I've got a free event with a really talented what does she call it? A restorative yoga practitioner who herself is a member of the community and has found a way to approach yoga that even some severely people can access. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then for people who are interested in my paid resources like my courses, the one that I'm kind of most excited about right now is Live with Dr. Stein. So I've just started that in February, and it's live sessions every 2 weeks where I talk about topics like for example, because I had to prepare this talk, I'm going to present it to my live community in a couple of months. So we meet, it's kind of similar to what you heard today but the presentation is much shorter, and then lots of time for Q&A. And then my other courses, like my neuroplasticity courses, are on there as well. And my pathways to improvement, which is really the foundation of self-management. So all the stuff you might want to learn about how to get better sleep, what's a healthy diet, how to pace, like the precursor of this presentation, how to manage emotions, how to figure out if you're depressed or anxious, or that's just part of, responding to your life situation, all that kind of thing.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.